fragmented records, fragmented self. Across longer time horizons, the most expensive misunderstandings arrive disguised as routine paperwork. A form rejects your name, a dashboard flags you as unknown, an approval queue stalls because one profile doesn't match another. The cost is not only delay, it is the quiet pressure of being forced to argue with databases about who you are. As systems scale, identity gets treated less like a lived continuity and more like a collection of fields that must satisfy different checklists. Over time, the institutional versions of you drift apart, and that drift becomes a governing force in your life. This is not primarily a failure of intentions. It is a mechanical result of many institutions optimizing for their own constraints, each storing the you they can measure, verify, and defend. The gap between experience and representation then becomes a kind of invisible tax, paid in extra steps, repeated explanations, lost opportunities, and increased scrutiny whenever the records disagree. In the short term, these systems promise convenience. A profile saves time, a credential reduces friction, a status label makes a meeting shorter. The incentive is straightforward. Institutions are rewarded for throughput, compliance, and legibility. When decisions must be made at scale, the system prefers what is easily comparable over what is deeply true. That preference becomes a feedback loop. The more decisions rely on standardized records, the more investment goes into making records decisive, and the more reality is pressured to conform to the record. One explicit constraint sits underneath nearly all of this. An institution can only act on what it can store, retrieve, and justify. Justify matters because many decisions are audited, sometimes by supervisors, sometimes by internal rules, sometimes by future disputes. So the institution builds identity as a defensible object: categories, timestamps, approvals, and data trails. Lived experience is continuous, records are discrete. The constraint is not merely technical, it is organizational. A trade-off follows: accuracy and nuance versus speed and consistency. If every case is treated with full context, the queue slows, the cost rises, and the decision becomes harder to standardize. If every case is reduced to stable fields, the queue moves, but the representation becomes brittle. Institutions often choose brittleness because brittleness is predictable, and predictability is governable. Over the mid-horizon, the multiplication begins. Each institution collects different attributes because each has different risks and incentives. One wants to prevent fraud, another wants to segment services, another wants to forecast outcomes, another needs a simple yes-no for access. So you acquire not one identity, but many: account identities, eligibility identities, reputational identities, credential identities. They are related, but not synchronized, and synchronization is expensive. That expense produces another constraint: interoperability is optional. Aligning records across boundaries requires shared standards, shared liability, shared governance, and shared maintenance. Those are hard agreements to sustain. So the system tolerates fragmentation. Across longer horizons, a second-order effect emerges. People begin to manage themselves as if they are portfolios of profiles. Attention shifts from being to proving. Time that could have been spent learning, caring, building, or resting is spent reconciling contradictions, uploading documents, correcting fields, monitoring scores, watching notifications for mismatches. The record becomes a competitor to the person. There is also uncertainty that cannot be engineered away. Records decay, addresses change, names change, context change, meaning shift. Data moves between systems, is interpreted by new policies, and is used for purposes that were not imagined when it was collected. A profile that seemed harmless in one era becomes decisive in another. The future use of today's representation is a tail risk. Low frequency, high consequence, hard to see in advance. So the question is not only who are you, it becomes which version of you is permitted to act, to enter, to rent, to work, to speak, to move. Systems reveal truth through what they permit, constrain, and ignore. When institutional identity fragments, responsibility becomes diffuse. No single database intends to replace a person, yet the assembled environment can still behave as if the record is the primary citizen and the human is a supporting document. Governance is part of the system. Every schema choice, every required field, every cannot proceed button encodes values about what counts as real. Attention is where this becomes intimate. If much of one's attention is forced into maintaining representations, keeping profiles aligned, staying legible, anticipating audits, then identity starts to be experienced as a compliance project. Not because people become shallow, but because the environment rewards legibility more reliably than it rewards complexity. Optimization pursued without reflection erodes meaning. The optimized self is often the most easily processed self. The civilizational consequence is subtle. Institutions increasingly coordinate around what they can measure, and people increasingly shape themselves toward what institutions can accept. That is not a moral failure. It is an emergent property of incentives, constraints, and scale. The question becomes how much drift a society tolerates between the lived person and the recorded person before trust thins and participation feels conditional. A single act of reflection. Choose one time horizon, this week, this year, or a decade, and name one hidden assumption you are relying on about your records. Perhaps the assumption is that your profiles agree, that a credential means the same thing everywhere, or that a mismatch will be treated as a minor inconvenience rather than a signal. Then, without rushing to fix anything, notice where the system places the burden when versions conflict. Does the burden fall on the institution to reconcile or on the person to explain? That distribution is not just administrative detail. It is a map of power and a measure of resilience. Uncertainty is not permission for neglect, but it is an invitation to see what is being optimized and what is being left out. You are more continuous than any checklist, yet you move through gates built for fields and flags. Humility begins by admitting the gap will never be fully eliminated. Time reveals failure modes.